Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. The Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
Just to remind everybody, if you're just joining us here on Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, our top story here on this Thursday, a federal appeals court temporarily pausing that ruling against President Trump's global tariffs while weighing a longer-lasting hold on the sweeping decision, with the administration vowing to take the matter to the U.S. Supreme Court if necessary. It's something we've been talking with our own Eric Larson about.
You know, as Eric was speaking to us, we were hearing from White House Senior Counselor for Trade and Manufacturing, Peter Navarro. He was outside the White House speaking to reporters. He said the administration, quote, fully expected a favorable ruling on tariffs. He also said that he got calls from countries this morning and talks are continuing. He said the court told us to go do it another way. And finally, Carol, he said he will hear in the next day or two from the U.S. Trade Representative.
All right. It's a fluid story.
Or we will hear, rather, from the U.S. Trade Representative, Jameson Greer.
All right. So we're going to be keeping on top of this. We want to continue the conversation. Still with us is Bloomberg News U.S. legal reporter Eric Larson right here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Joining the conversation is Jimmy Gurley. He's professor of law, founder and director of Exoneration Justice Clinic, concurrent professor of political sciences is at Notre Dame Law School, joining us on the phone. Jimmy, we've been talking with our Eric Larson, who has been covering this for us, especially as the news has been developing. What's your take on this latest legal action, the appeals court allowing the Trump tariffs to stay in effect at least for now?
Well, it's a very fluid and dynamic situation, to say the least. With respect to the original ruling yesterday by the Federal Court of International Trade, my sense is that the court got it right, because the Trump administration has based the tariffs on something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA. And when I worked at the Treasury Department and as Undersecretary for Enforcement, one of the offices that I was responsible for overseeing is the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. And OFAC is responsible for supervising and implementing the government's economic sanctions programs based on IEEPA. And so I'm very familiar with the IEEPA statute and what it permits. And there's nothing in the IEEPA statute that authorizes the use of tariffs under the statute. And the statute basically authorizes or gives the president some very broad sweeping powers to impose economic sanctions. But again, at the same time, in order to trigger the use of those economic sanctions, the president must declare a national emergency. And this national emergency must involve an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the United States that originates in whole or in substantial part outside the United States. And so here, I think there's two issues. One is, is there in fact such a unusual and extraordinary threat to national security, foreign policy, or the economy of the United States? What is the nature of that threat? Is the nature of that threat a trade deficit? Does a trade deficit constitute an unusual or an extraordinary threat to the U.S. economy? Here, I think the lower court concluded no, that a trade deficit doesn't rise to this level of an unusual or extraordinary threat. In the case of Canada, I think the threat was different. And I think the claim was that Canada wasn't doing an adequate job of protecting its borders, supervising its borders. And as a result, fentanyl was coming into the United States. But here, I believe that the amount of fentanyl, percentage-wise, is coming from Canada is a very minuscule number, maybe 1%. And so again, it kind of strains credulity to think that constitutes an unusual or extraordinary threat that would justify the use of these.
I want to jump in because I think Peter Navarro of the White House weighed in on that a little bit and called it an emergency in a different way, that what he said, and these were not his words exactly, but the gist of what he said this morning to our surveillance team was, it's an emergency here in the United States because it's affecting the working age population here. And U.S. workers are dying as a result. So it's an economic emergency. Is that a legal argument?
No, I think you've got to focus, on the target. And here, the target of the tariffs, we just focus on Canada and the fentanyl crisis. Here is Canada responsible for this? It is the fentanyl is coming across the Canadian border. Does it rise to the level of unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security? So it's not just that it kills Americans. I mean, that's not the test. The test is, does it affect national security? Does it constitute an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security?
Yeah, I actually have a quick question, if you don't mind. You mentioned earlier that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act doesn't even mention tariffs. And of course, that was one of the arguments that was used in court. Given that, why was Trump even trying to use, or is he still trying to use this law to issue tariffs when it's not even wasn't even envisioned by Congress?
I think it's a misuse of the statute. I think it's probably a very, that the Trump administration is interpreting the statute quite broadly, and that if there is such a threat to national security, the economy, or foreign policy, that the president can implement any type of economic sanctions. I think it's a very broad reading of the statute, but the statute is very specific. I mean, it does indicate, for example, the blocking and freezing of assets, preventing financial transactions. And so it's very explicit. And with respect to the language of the statute, tariffs is not included in the text.
Okay.
All right, so appreciate it. Ongoing, and I'm sure there'll be more headlines on it. Our thanks to Jimmy Gourlay, professor of law and founder and director of the Exoneration Justice Clinic, also concurrent professor of political science at Notre Dame Law School, and of course, who we lean on, Eric Larson, Bloomberg News U.S. legal reporter, for the ins and outs of all of this and coming what's next. Eric, thank you so much as well.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app, or watch us live on YouTube.
So we talked earlier about the setback for President Trump and his tariff push. Those actions and threats of higher tariffs, as you know, have yet to be settled. We might get some more clarity. We'll see what happens tomorrow with maybe the Trump administration asking the Supreme Court to weigh in. I got to say, some already saying the train has left the station when it comes to the U.S.-China relationship, the impact that this kind of back and forth that we've seen, not just in the second Trump administration, Tim, but what we've seen over the last few years.
Well, let's bring in Elizabeth Economy. She's Hargrove Senior Fellow and co-chair of the program on the U.S., China, and the World at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She's author of many books, most recently, The World According to China. She joins us from New York City. When it comes to the relationship between the U.S. and China, the Trump administration this week announcing it would start revoking those Chinese student visas while also introducing new restrictions on the sales of chip design software and reportedly some jet engine parts to China. How would you describe the phase of a trade war or a trade negotiation that we're in with China?
I think we're still in a trade war. We had a tariff pause, a few weeks ago after Treasury Secretary Bessent and USTR Greer met with their Chinese counterparts, and we had that, terrific lowering, reducing of the tariff levels on both sides. And I think that led everybody to breathe a big sigh of relief. And we thought, maybe we were going to have stability in the relationship moving forward, at least, for the next 90 days, and perhaps some movement toward an actual, negotiation and agreement. But I think that the Trump administration really divorced that set of discussions and negotiations from everything else that they wanted to get done with China. And I think what we've seen now is that means, no cessation of tough measures, whether, as you mentioned, is continuing, export controls or now this revocation of student visas. So I think we're still in the midst of a trade war. We're in the midst of a significant strategic decoupling. And all we had really was a tariff pause.
Hey, Elizabeth, what does the world look like with an increasingly decoupled U.S. and China?
I mean, I think it's going to be complicated. I think it's not going to be as straightforward as some people might imagine with, the U.S. and its allies and partners on one side and China and its partners on another side, because it doesn't actually have any formal allies except for North Korea. So I think it's not going to be that simple. And I think we've seen evidence of that, where President Trump went to the Middle East and came back with all these big announcements of new trade arrangements and investments and defense deals. And we just saw China this past week do the exact same thing and bring the countries from Southeast Asia into it and try to sort of bridge from the Middle East to Southeast Asia, sort of new trade and investment relations. And so I think it's going to be, everybody out to try to compete for partners and allies and strike the best deals. But there's not going to be that sort of decoupling of the world that I think probably the Trump administration has in its mind, because, for many and for most countries, quite frankly, China is their largest trading partner.
Right.
And while they don't want to lose the U.S. market, they're also not willing to sacrifice their trade and investment ties with China.
So what happened to the argument that we've said, okay, there's tensions, but let's not forget, people, these two countries, the two largest economies in the world, they still kind of need each other. Is that still the case?
I think within the Trump administration, there's a range of opinions, and I think it goes from somebody like Peter Navarro, who would be perfectly happy to have not just a strategic decoupling, but really a complete decoupling of the two economies. I think the sort of on the national security side, most of the cabinet members are quite hawkish when it comes to China, and then I think there are some in the administration, and maybe Treasury Secretary Bessent, maybe Commerce Secretary Lutnick, who see the benefits of trade and investment with China and have made very clear that, while the relationship is challenged, they want to continue to engage. They don't see anything past a strategic decoupling. They're not looking, and I think Secretary Bessent made that clear, they're not looking for a complete decoupling of the relationship. But it is fraught. And a lot of that has to do not just with what the Trump administration is trying to do now, but with what Xi Jinping has been doing, for 12 years as General Secretary of the Communist Party and president of the country, which is really challenging the United States, challenging the liberal rules-based international order on issues like, pushing to have the de-dollarization of the global economy, pushing for the end of the U.S.-led alliance system, pushing for a whole new definition of human rights. So there are some pretty substantive ways in which our two countries are in real conflict, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to try to find areas of common ground and common purpose. And that, frankly, is what is entirely missing from this administration. I'm
trying to understand, and I think a lot of us are trying to understand the position that China can negotiate from right now. On the one hand, there's a consumer in China that's under pressure. The property crisis there, the economy has been under pressure, going really back to COVID. But at the same time, what we've learned is that in recent years, the country's made incredible strides when it comes to driverless car technology, EV technology, and some of the really high-tech stuff that, in fact, the U.S. is trying to prevent the proliferation of in China. What can you tell us about the position of strength or weakness that China can negotiate from right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a fundamental miscalculation on the part of the Trump administration when they first began these negotiations. There's sort of an assumption that, in fact, because we import so much more from China than China imports from us, that somehow we had all the leverage. But the truth is, first of all, we have a much greater single source or sole source dependency on China for certain goods. So about 30% of the goods that we import from China, we are reliant for China for 70% or more of those goods globally. China doesn't have that with the United States. We've already seen China has spent 4 years now or more moving away from the United States, reducing their trade dependence since 2019, reducing their trade dependence on the United States from about 19% to now 14%. Our soybeans, right, even after the tariff pause, China's not back to purchasing the same level of soybeans from American farmers. Brazil is more competitive, so they're purchasing their soybeans from Brazil. So one of the big dangers of this Trump-launched tariff war is that China was already on a path to its own form of strategic decoupling, and now it's just accelerated that process. So I think we misjudged, right, their dependence, their reliance on us. as you suggested, the Chinese economy is troubled. It has been since COVID. It hasn't bounced back. But China has the ability to suppress, right, the people in ways that the U.S. government does not. And at the same time, their entire innovation and advanced manufacturing ecosystem has just taken off after the past 4 years. And so you're really dealing with two different Chinese economies. And for the sake of the tariff war, we should be focused on the one that's most competitive in that tech and innovation space. And so we really need to focus on what we should be doing at home, investing in ourselves and moving ourselves forward, as opposed to simply trying to look backwards and trip China up with these tariffs.
It's a tariff war, right? We should remind everybody that also this week, the administration seeking to block Huawei Technologies from selling advanced AI chips anywhere in the world, prompting an angry rebuke from Beijing. Elizabeth, it is about tech and tariffs. It's also, though, we had this week the Trump administration announcing it would start revoking Chinese student visas. So there's also that aspect that's going on. Who loses in that restriction? The U.S., Beijing, everybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides lose, just like the tariff war, both sides lose. I mean, truth be told, there are reasons to be concerned about some Chinese students in the United States. I mean, we saw a number of years ago where the U.S. sent back 1,000 Chinese students and postdocs who, had affiliations with Chinese military and technology universities and institutes, who were probably placed here by the Chinese government to access, advanced intellectual property from the labs that they were working in. So they weren't real graduate students or postdocs. We want to make sure that doesn't happen anymore. That being said, the vast majority of Chinese students are here to learn, to take advantage of the openness and the outstanding education that American institutions provide. A lot of the students that come here in the STEM fields end up staying and contributing in an outsized way to our own innovation ecosystem. I don't think we want to punish, these students. I think what we need to do is take our time and figure out how to use a scalpel to review them before they get here and keep out the bad elements, but let in the vast majority of Chinese students who are such important contributors to our own success moving forward.
We're speaking with Elizabeth Economy, Hargrove Senior Fellow and Co-Chair of the Program on the U.S., China, and the World at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. She's written many books, including The World According to China. Given your expertise in the area, I'm just curious, from your perspective, how you think we, as the United States, or if you were advising the Trump administration, how we should handle the relationship with China. What would you do?
That's a big question. I mean, to be frank, I served in the Biden administration in the Department of Commerce as a senior advisor to Secretary Raimondo for China. And so I actually think the Biden administration strategy was a pretty good one, right? Because it focused on first investing at home and making sure that our own innovation and advanced manufacturing, was up to speed. CHIPS and Science Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, all of these were about making sure that the U.S. was able to compete with China in the 21st century. We also had a vision that it was important to work with our allies and partners. Because nothing that we do alone is going to be sufficient to compete with China. If we put an export control, on a certain technology, odds are high that one or other of our allies might also have something similar. We need them on board to put controls on those same technologies if, in fact, they're not going to end up backfilling, right? So that just our industries suffer and somebody else makes money. But the way the Trump administration is operating, it's hardly likely that our allies and partners are going to be excited to work with us because, everything we're doing to China, or not everything, but a lot of things we're doing to China, we're also doing to them. And then there was an element of modernizing our defensive economic tools so that we could protect ourselves, our national economic security. So, yes, let's think about making sure we're not too dependent on China for critical minerals and rare earth elements and the processing of those things. Let's make sure we're not too dependent on them for any critical technologies, for, personal protective equipment that we needed during COVID. I think that's smart policy, and the Trump administration is going to continue that.
Elizabeth,
but above all, also tried to maintain channels of communication and to continue to try to find areas where we could work with China. Because through all of this, right, we don't want this conflict to devolve into kinetic conflict. And if we're not talking, if we're not trying to work together, the likelihood of that happening just increases.
Your book, The World According to China, that was out about 3.5, 4 years ago, I believe, right? 2021. When you look at the next 50 years, 100 years, is it going to be better for China or better for the U.S.? And forgive me, but just about 35 seconds here.
Okay, you know, I'm always going to be bullish on the United States. So I think if we get it right, and I think if we
Is that your heart speaking or your head speaking?
Yeah, no, you know, I think, listen, China has some pretty fundamental challenges, and we haven't had a chance to talk about these on this particular show, but there are some deep-seated, deep-rooted issues that the Chinese government is confronting. We only lose if we continue to do what we're doing right now, which is reduce uncertainty and chaos into the system.
Elizabeth Economy, thank you so much. So appreciate it.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
All right, earnings season is not done, as we know, and we even have more earnings coming next week. I think it's fair to say that investors are dealing with a lot right now when it comes to this market. Just to try to keep up when it comes to trade, the latest is a federal appeals court has temporarily blocked a ruling that threatened to throw out the bulk of President Donald Trump's tariff agenda. It offers some hope to the White House. That's just one of the issues that investors are facing. Watching all of this and what it means for investors is Dr. David Kelly, Chief Global Strategist and Head of Global Market Insight Strategy Team at JP Morgan Asset Management. The whole firm has about $3.6 trillion in assets under management. David joins us here in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. I was kind of joking that you needed a law degree to understand the back and forth with the different courts in the last 24 hours that we've heard from. But one thing that I think has become clear is that it didn't seem like investors or traders actually bought the idea of some sort of reprieve from these tariffs. We saw initially with futures last night shoot way higher when this decision came out, or when this ruling came out, but then that faded and it didn't even get much of a reprieve early in the morning.
Well, and I think that makes sense. I mean, first of all, investors are just suffering from incredible tariff whiplash. I mean, it's we have somebody on my team whose job it is every day to try and figure out the effective average tariff rate that the United States is deploying on or imposing on everybody else, and Mary Park does a good job, but she's the hardest working person on my team, and just trying to keep up with
so
that.
What do you guys see? Because our Bloomberg economics team is basically roughly 13-ish% is what they're saying.
That's where we're ending up too, and of course that assumes the same. You don't allow for a change in the volumes of trade, and we know the volume of trade will be impacted by this. But it is, and I think that's the important point. Because, you know, where were we at the start of the year? We were about 2.5%, and now we're 13%. And so, yes, the market didn't bounce off of the idea that maybe this all gets blocked. But even if it did get blocked, I mean, why should we be up year to date? I mean, if you think about the economy we came into this year with, we had a good economy, but we also had a lot of optimism after the election. And since then, we've had sort of the Doge cuts. We've had all this controversy around immigration. We've had budgets, a budget proposal, which looks like it's going to expand the deficit in 2026, 2027. And most of all, we've got all these tariffs, which are throwing sand in the gears of global trade, and all the uncertainty that's coming from all of this. And all of that is still weighing on the market. So the market should not be higher than it was at the start of the year. And I think maybe if we don't bounce off every little piece of relief, it's because, this picture overall is still pretty uncertain.
Right. Uncertainty still rules. You know what I think about? And David, you got a PhD and an MA in economics from Michigan State University, a BA in economics from University College Dublin in the Republic of Ireland. I studied economics. I keep thinking about the cross-section of economics and markets. And I'm wondering if the global economy is still as intertwined as it was, or are we kind of opening up a new chapter on that?
I think I think other countries are more dependent upon global trade than we are. the United States only imports about 15% of its GDP. It exports about 11%. If you go to places like the Eurozone or the UK or Japan, those numbers are much, much higher. So what happens in the United States is actually mostly about the United States. But still, these tariffs do push up prices, and they do slow our exports, and they do add uncertainty, particularly for global U.S. companies, because even though the U.S. economy is pretty domestic, all of these companies are not that domestic, and it's difficult for all of them.
A couple truths about our economy. One is it's powered by consumers,
Yes.
and it's powered by services. Given that the average tariff rate is really 5x since the beginning of the year,
Yeah.
what does that do to consumers?
It punches them, but it doesn't fell them. I mean, it's definitely a negative, but we have the most resilient consumers in the world. I mean, unless you melt the plastic, they will keep on spending. And I think we've seen that. I mean, even in the first quarter, with all this going on, consumer spending was rising. I think it's going to rise again in the second quarter. Not that fast. But consumers try to put on the headphones and ignore it, and so we're still seeing that. So I think that's one of the big advantages of the U.S. And of course, we have had huge gains in wealth in the last few years. People can spend some of that. I think people try to just drown out the noise coming out of Washington as much as possible.
But help me out, because often when we see debt levels, consumer debt levels go up, and then we're looking at whether the ability of consumers to actually pay it. I mean, we get concerned, we get worried, because there is a point where, right, your debt becomes potentially for a household problematic, or that debt is so much and mortgage rates are still higher than they were, that like people don't do these kinds of things.
It's a drag on the economy, but it's not fatal. The thing about debt, of course, is the rate at which you finance it.
Correct.
And 2/3 of U.S. household debt is mortgages, and those mortgages got locked in at 3-point-something% a few years ago. Now, that is a huge problem for people trying to buy a house right now, because that mortgage is not available and it's not going to be available.
Right.
But it also means that the actual debt service ratio, the percentage of disposable income that people are using to service their debt, is way down from where it was before the great financial crisis, and it's still not that high. So, people talk about credit card debt, but credit card debt is actually a pretty small part of overall consumer debt. So overall, we're seeing, yes, there is some strain from increased credit card debt and slow increase in delinquencies, but it's nothing like before the great financial crisis.
We're going to get payrolls next week for the month of May. I'm curious about the view that you have when it comes to hard data, and if we're going to start to see cracks appear in hard data. We haven't seen that yet.
We'll see a little. We saw a pretty ugly unemployment claims number this morning. 240,000 was a little high, and the number on continuing claims, over 1.9 million, was also a little high. But I think we're still at the early stages of this. One of the things that helps the American economy, makes it resilient, is consumers, of course. The other thing that's really helping right now is businesses don't want to lay workers off, because it was so hard to hire them. You go back to March of 2022,
right.
We had 12 million job openings, and gradually they filled the positions. And they still don't have all the people they want. And so until they see the whites of the eyes of recession, they don't want to fire them. And I think that is holding down layoffs. Now, what we don't know is what it's doing to hiring. Because we do think that there's a bit of a hiring freeze or a hiring slowdown going on, and the question is how fast does that feed in to the numbers? But that's an unanswered question. So
right, labor hoarding real, right? But it doesn't mean companies are inclined to hire more people.
And it's very important, because what people don't realize is just how dynamic the labor market is. If you look at that job openings and labor turnover report, in the United States, we hire about 65 million people in a year. About 62 million people leave a job for a 3 million job gain. But 65 million, that is 250,000 people fill out a new W-4 form every single day. If you just pull back on that just a little bit, we're going to pause, then suddenly you've got an employment problem. And that's what I think the next two jobs reports will tell us.
We will be watching. David Kelly, Chief Global Strategist, head of the Global Market Insight Strategy team over at JP Morgan Asset Management, right here in studio. You're listening and watching Bloomberg.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.